Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dave Peterson. I'm the interim director of the Harkin Institute of Public Policy. For those of you who don't know much about the Harkin Institute, it was created about a year and a half ago by the Board of Regents, named after one of Iowa State's alumni, Senator Tom Harkin. The mission of the Institute broadly is to conduct and support research on important public policy concerns, particularly public policy concerns that fit the senator's legacy and his accomplishments in Congress. So issues of education, of accessibility, of labor, international development, and as such, the Institute does a variety of things, right? So we work with undergraduates on campus, and we provide some mentoring for undergraduate research. We eventually will be supporting faculty research as the resources become a little freer. And we host public events, which is what a lot of the focus so far has been. This is the first event of this kind for the Harkin Institute. It won't be the last. Today we've brought together a group of academics, political scientists, who are amongst the best scholars of political campaigns and elections in the discipline. And we brought together also two leading journalists on the topic as well, and to sort of talk a little bit about the broad theme being the intersection between social science, politics, journalism, and sort of what we as social scientists can contribute to journalists and what we can learn from journalists and from campaigns. I scheduled myself for 15 minutes, and I'm not going to take all of it, but I do have a couple of the logistical things I want to make sure I add, which are, first, there is Wi-Fi available for those of you who are not on campus. The guest system here is very good, and it's a sort of full access to everything, or so I'm told, and so if you walk through the system, you can log in and just follow the instructions, and it's pretty clear. Second, students who are here because they're interested, of course, but also for the potential promise of extra credit. There are sheets in the back table to sort of sign in or check off, depending upon your class, for the extra credit that you will be no doubt earning by learning so much today. Faculty from other universities who are here, welcome, and I'm pleased that so many of you are here. Track me down at some point, because I have, if you RSVP'd ahead of time, I will be providing lunch, and so I'll get you coordinated with that. And I can help with parking if you parked in the Union. I can get that validated, essentially. So we're a full-service shop here at the Harkin Institute. So I think we'll start a hair early, if nobody minds, if Joanne doesn't mind. Joanne's being the important one on this. Our first presentation is... I'm not sure where I'm supposed to point them.
Maybe if you use the right one.
No, there it goes. It's a blank button. Okay. I got it. This was, I'm sorry, this one controls the screen. Okay. That one controls the computer. Okay. We're not great with technology yet, but we're getting there. So our first speaker today is Joanne Miller. Joanne is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. She's in the Department of Political Science. Her PhD is in psychology from Ohio State University. Joanne writes a lot and does a lot of work on the intersection of psychology and politics, and in particular, understanding the role of motivation in political behavior. With that, I'll turn things over to Joanne. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave, for inviting me. You may regret that in a bit here, but we'll. So I'm going to start off the day by not talking about the 2012 election. So in case, yeah, there you go. I'm going to talk more generally about research that I've been doing over a number of years. So I'm going to talk about some older stuff and some newer stuff on bring what we know in psychology about motivations for behavior, pro-social action, into the study of political participation more broadly. And so what I'm going to do today, is very briefly, I don't want to harp too much on the literature here, say something about the current state of the literature in political science on what motivates or on political participation, tell you a little bit about what I think is missing, and then I want to talk about a field experiment and a survey experiment that I've done to test some aspects of some theories from psychology, and then make some concluding remarks. So, summary of current thinking in one slide. People become active in politics when the costs are not so high as to trump the benefits. The costs are less burdensome for people higher in socioeconomic status and skills, and people are more likely to participate when they're asked to participate. Now, this is way simplifying a very large literature, but I don't have that much time. So, what I want to argue is that the focus of these, what I call resource-based theories, most prominently Verba, Schlotzman, and Brady, and even more recently Schlotzman, Verba, and Brady, is that the focus of these resource-based theories has resulted in what I argue has resulted in an overemphasis on the ability dimension of participation at the expense of the motivation dimension. And I argue that, that this actually provides a distorted picture of the decision to participate. Resource-based models, political activity is a behavior. It involves a conscious choice. Current theory sort of boils this choice down to two questions. Can I participate? Have I been given the opportunity to participate? What I argue is that if we incorporate motivation into the picture, maybe the first question that we want to ask is, do people want to participate? Then can they participate? And I'm not making a strong argument that one of these questions comes first. These probably are largely simultaneous questions that people may ask themselves. But I want to put an emphasis on the want part in this talk and in my research. Okay. Now, I argue that if we focus on motivation, one of the critiques, or one of the arguments against focusing on motivation in political science is that motivation is difficult to measure, and that it's also it can be very circular with participation itself. Okay? And so the two, wanting to participate and participating, can be difficult to tease apart. Okay? So what I do in my research is I take an experimental approach to establish a causal priority of motivation and separate out motivation from the act of participating. And so I'm going to do that here, and I'm going to argue that focusing on motives can provide insight into how to craft messages aimed at increasing participation. Okay. So what types of motives? I'm going to focus on a study that, first on prospect theory. Threats of losses versus opportunities for gains. Okay? So briefly, what prospect theory says is that we are more motivated to avoid losses than to obtain a gain. Okay? Losing something that we have hurts more than gaining something that we want feels good. Okay? So we've got two motives that we can focus on here that I'm going to do in my research: threat of losses, opportunities for gains. I also draw on other work in psychology by Mark Snyder, who's also at the University of Minnesota. He's studied for many years the motivations for volunteering and pro-social action more broadly. And he's created what he calls the Volunteer Functions Inventory that focuses on 5/6 ego-defensive and ego-enhancing, sometimes are separate. But these motives in being causally related to people choosing to engage in volunteer acts like working in a soup kitchen, working for Habitat Humanity, and so forth. And the two that I'm going to focus on today are self-interest and value expression. And then also we can ask activists themselves why they participate. And there are lots of reasons. Some of them overlap with the psychology theories. The one that I'm going to highlight today is civic duty, more broadly than that, American identity. Okay. So we know that political organizations and campaigns tap these motives. Here are some examples from, these are old examples of quotes from letters This is an old one that could be a new one. The NRA, anti-gun politicians are moving closer and closer to banning your guns, so on and so forth. This one is obviously old. It's People for the American Way letter. When Newt Gingrich threatens to zero out all funding for public broadcasting, there's every reason to believe he can make good on that threat. And here's another example. This is from National Abortion Rights Action League. You will become part of 400,000 women and men who share your commitment to protecting this precious personal right that's now being so threatened. We see a lot more threat letters than opportunity letters, but I'm going to show you how I study the opportunity side of prospect theory in a minute. Political campaigns tap lots of different motives. Here is a mailer, again, relatively old, a collective interest sort of appeal. When someone asks you where you were, what will you say? Make that cute baby's life better by voting. Here's a self-interest mailer. Does your daily commute look like this? If so, thank Chuck Robb. Here's a basic appeal to values. Just generally, Montana values. And probably the classic example of appeals to values are the Four Freedoms, World War II war bonds ads. Okay. So we know that campaigns and organizations use these types of appeals, and what I'm interested in is studying the differences in their effectiveness. Okay. So the first study I want to talk about briefly is a field experiment that I conducted many years ago, many years ago, that tests aspects of prospect theory, threats versus opportunities. Okay. So I'm going to look at the effectiveness of threat appeals versus a threat appeal versus an opportunity appeal in motivating participation. And I'm going to examine two types of behavior in the context of a field experiment: contributing money and direct attitude expression. So what I did with this study is I worked with NARAL Ohio and crafted 3 letters. Let me back up for a minute and say that I tried to also work with Ohio Right to Life because I wanted to do both, and they weren't interested in working with me on this. So I just have NARAL in this study. I've done other studies with both sides of the issue and with other issues as well, but I'm going to focus on this one because this is the true field experiment that I have. So I worked with them to create 3 different letters, a control letter, and then 2 letters that frame the issue of abortion to potential NARAL supporters as either being a policy change threat, so threats to abortion rights, or an opportunity to gain rights. Okay? And then at the end of the letter that went out to potential contributors, they were asked, please contribute money. They were also given a postcard that they were asked to please sign and return back to NARAL so NARAL could package them all up and mail them to President Clinton, which is a pretty standard, pretty standard appeal in interest group letters. Okay. My sample in this study was 9,000 women who were registered Democrats living in Franklin County, Ohio. I was attempting to limit the sample here to people who would be the highest likelihood of being supporters of NARAL. And they were randomly assigned to one of 3 letter conditions. I'm not going to really go through the letters too much here. The control letter was basically, we're NARAL, this is what we do, give us money, and sign the postcard, okay, and send that back to us. The threat letter added this content. The very beginning of the letter started with members of U.S. Congress are trying to change laws to make it more difficult for women to obtain safe and legal abortion. Okay? Again, prevent these laws from being passed. And all of these were kicking around in Congress someplace at the time. Okay? So it's a list of 3, and then these threats are real, again, hitting home the threat. Women will lose many of the rights they currently have. Okay? The opportunity letter has the same format, but frames the other side of this. So members of U.S. Congress are trying to change laws so women can obtain safe and legal abortions without restrictions. Again, these were all kicking around someplace in Congress at the time. As a field experiment, I wasn't using deception in these letters because I wasn't able to debrief people afterwards. Again, these opportunities are real. If these laws are passed, women will gain many of the rights they currently don't have. Okay? So the format of the letter was exactly the same except for this content and the threat and the opportunity letters. Okay? I'm not going to show you any tables, any graphs here. I'm just going to summarize the results of this study. People who received the threat letter contributed the most money to NARAL. We tracked and I knew who got what letter. They contributed the most money. Also, more people contributed. So not only the number of people was higher, the threat letter, but also they contributed more money. But interestingly, people who received the opportunity letter returned the most postcards. So the threat letter motivated contributions to the organization. The opportunity letter motivated letters to Clinton encouraging him to work on this issue. Okay, so threat caused an increase in contributions, opportunity caused an increase in indirect attitude expression. And this kind of makes sense. Clinton was pro-choice. If you frame this issue as an opportunity to gain rights, maybe the way to go there is to encourage the person who you think is going to be sympathetic to that. And so this, I wasn't expecting this. I was expecting threat would have the most effect every place. So this got me thinking more broadly about how motives can lead people to different behavioral paths depending on whether they think that that action is going to get them, satisfy the motive that gives rise to the action to begin with. Okay. So the second study I'm going to go through here is a survey experiment. So this one I'm not measuring actual behavior. I'm measuring willingness to participate in the future here. And this one I'm focusing on three different motives: value expression, American identity, and self-interest. And here I'm going to be measuring willingness to participate in a variety of political acts with the goal of looking at whether what I saw with threat and opportunity, with the differences in financial contributions and postcards, has some broader generalizability to other motives. Okay. So briefly, this is a survey experiment, a representative sample of over 4,000 U.S. adults 18 and older. Data were collected online via knowledge networks. I'm not going to get into too much of the methodological details here. If you're interested, I can talk more about it later. Okay. So in the context of the survey, I first assessed all the traditionally examined antecedents of participation, all the resource, socioeconomic status, skills, and then political engagement, interest in politics. Had people been contacted in the past to participate? Then there's the experimental manipulation, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And then I lastly assessed people's willingness to participate in the near future. Among the behaviors that I looked at were voting, volunteering for a candidate, contributing money, and participating in a protest. I looked at others as well, but I'm going to focus on these four today. So the experimental manipulation. Respondents were told that there was this new organization called Democracy Rocks, not particularly creative, but Democracy Rocks aimed at encouraging people to get involved in politics. Because this was an online internet survey that people did in their homes, I did actually buy the Democracy Rocks domain name, and I did put up something just in case people decided to Google it in the middle of the survey. So it was there. They were randomly assigned to one of 6 conditions, and I'm going to focus on just the value, expression, self-interest, and American identity ones today, and the control condition. And so what they saw then were screenshots of what they were told was basically a mock-up of a pamphlet for this organization. Okay? And so I'm going to just briefly go through the control condition screens. So Democracy Rocks, why should you get involved in politics? Okay. There are thousands of ways to get involved. Democracy Rocks is a nonpartisan organization, tries to encourage people to participate. And then 6 ways to get involved. And this I stole from another group online that was working to encourage people to participate, largely edited somewhat. So that's all the control condition people see. I'll show you just one of the other conditions. So you notice here there's a question, and in the control condition there's no answer to that question. The experimental conditions answer it. So after that first question slide, here's the value expression manipulation. The answer here is to express your personal values and beliefs. Just reiterates that point. The next slide, I actually asked them to think a little bit about this and type their thoughts about how politics is related to their values. And I have 4,400 of these typed responses that I haven't even touched. Okay? There's a treasure trove of data here on these open-ended responses, connecting the motives, asking them to free think on this. This was really just intended to make sure they don't just whip through the slides, the screens quickly. And then the last slide then, again, reiterates the values manipulation. And then they got that final 6 ways to get involved. Okay? Real quick, the self-interest condition focuses on improving standard of living. And then the American identity condition, show that you're a good American, do your civic duty. Okay, so I'm not going to show you the regression tables here. I'm just going to show you 3 charts. And what these are the differences in the predicted willingness between the experimental condition and the control condition. So I'm just going to match American identity compared to control, value expression compared to control, self-interest on the 3 different, 4 different behaviors. Okay. So here's the value expression motive. Had a significant positive effect on willingness to volunteer and willingness to participate in a protest, but not on voting or contributing money. And this is controlling for all the other stuff. American identity, not on voting. Volunteering, contributing money, not on protesting. Protesting is a contentious political act. It's not very American identity, civic duty type of behavior, apparently. Self-interest, nothing. Okay. If anything, there's a teeny negative effect of self-interest on voting. Okay. Maybe little hint, and actually in other work that I've done, that is a significant negative effect. It's not significant here. Okay. So one thing that I want to highlight here is no effect on voting for any of these motives. And in fact, when I look at the other motives in this study, there's no effect on voting either. And I can say more about that. Most of these motives don't, in most of the work that I've done, I don't see a lot of movement on turnout or willingness to vote on these motives. And I think a lot of that has to do with voting as being potentially more habitual and less movable than some of these others. Okay. So I don't even know where I am on time. Okay, so I wasn't going to talk about this other study. I'm not going to talk about it in detail here, but I want to just show you some side-by-side comparisons to show you sort of replication of these findings. I did another study that was just a survey. It was actually the pre-study before this experiment, sort of a proof of concept study, where I measured the importance of these motives for people, and I used, I adapted Mark Snyder's volunteer functions inventory to do this for politics. So I just measured the motives and I correlated them with willingness to participate. And so what you see here, the first slide, the study 2 slide, is the value expression motive from the experiment. Okay? And here it is for the survey. Okay? So again, you see nothing on voting in the survey, volunteering, and here contributing money pops out, and protesting. So basic replicability, or basically replicates. There we go. We'll go with that one. Okay. For value expression. Okay. Here's self-interest. Again, that's just the slide that I showed you before, the study 2 slide. Okay. And here it is in the survey. And here's the negative and positive and significant, negative significant effect on voting. When for people for whom self-interest is important to them, they're actually express less willingness to vote. Maybe confirmation of a little bit of rational choice theory there, but not really much else going on. A little bit on protesting. And then the last one here isn't an exact match. You've got the American identity. In the survey, I measured a social motive, wanting to meet people, hang out with friends, meet people. And here you can see that volunteering and protesting, and then a marginal significant effect for contributing money. But the two social acts, volunteering and protesting, are primarily the ones that you see people being more interested in doing if they've got a social motive. And some, the American Identity one again, there. So I just want to say a few things here in conclusion, and sort of where I think this, what I think this research tells us, and where I think that we can go with this. First, I want to reiterate a point that I made earlier. When you start to take motives seriously in thinking about political participation, it moves us in the direction of really dissecting different types of participation and looking at them separately. Because different acts, voting, volunteering, contributing money, all are political, but they all have serve very different purposes for the individual. If my motive for getting involved in politics is social, voting isn't going to cut it. So if we start to take motives seriously and a motivational approach to studying participation seriously, we can't any longer add up the 9 behaviors in the NES into an index and throw that into an equation as our dependent variable and study participation that way. I think we really need to start dissecting the behaviors and start really looking at whether people think various activities satisfy various motives. This also then leads us down the path of looking at what predicts whether people stay participating over the long haul or participate and stop, and participate again. Because if the reason for getting involved may not have been political in the first place, say social, okay, the person isn't getting what they want out of it. I went to graduate school, wanted to meet people who weren't graduate students, started volunteering for a political organization because I'm interested in politics, but my goal was a social one. And I diligently went every week, folded letters at the table with this group of 20 people, and after a couple of months I realized I didn't like these people. So I stopped going. But it's not because I didn't care about politics anymore, and it's not because we all study ourselves, right? All of our research, there's some aspect of ourselves in it. It wasn't because I didn't care about the issue or about politics anymore. It's because my goal was a social one, and I wasn't being fulfilled in that way. So again, matching motives with type of participation and looking at ebbs and flows in participation over time and being able to use motives as a way to predict that. And then lastly, I think that focusing on motives can tell us something more broadly. Resource-based theories have told us a lot about the representational biases in our system. Okay? No doubt those biases exist. But what I argue is that focusing on motives may point to ways to alleviate those biases. Knowing that people who have a lot more money are more likely to participate doesn't tell us a lot about how we can get people to participate. You can't just give people more money. And if motives are important, giving them more money isn't going to cut it anyway. Okay? So I argue that focusing on motives can point to ways to alleviate bias in the system through education programs and also interest groups, political campaign messages that can either change motives, strengthen motives, connect motives with behavior to get people to participate. And that is it. And I survived. I didn't fall over. I'm so sick. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
We have time for
Some questions?
We have a mic up over there that I don't know if it works, and it looks like it's cordless, so I can take it out. But I think I'll do that.
Okay.
So. You want the screen on?
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't matter.
I'll build onto it.
You'll do
I'll see if it's very dated. I know.
That was really dated.
Is this?
Excuse me while
I'll push some things. Okay, so I think we'll just
just speak loudly.
speak loudly and Joanne can call on folks. I think is the right way to do it.
Yeah.
If you could introduce yourself as well.
My name is Lynn Fabric, and I'm a political science professor at UCLA. You started by setting up sort of a contest between the instrumental thoughts about turnout and then these more psychological ones. And I wondered if you can say a little bit about the size of these effects, maybe by themselves, but also, and maybe especially relative to the effects of allowing people to mail their ballots in or do these other kinds of more instrumental reforms
Yeah.
on election day.
Yeah, so I can't say anything directly to that because I don't have any data on that pits these kinds of motives against more practical reforms. I can say something about these effects relative to the other standard variables like resources and interest in politics and so forth that are that we see as being predictive of participation, I would say more correlated with participation. And what I can say there is that what I see is these motives always predict above and beyond the resources, recruitment, and so forth. These effects tend to be slightly bigger than resources, but not as big as the big driver in my research and all the others, as well as interest in politics, is always the biggest predictor in these models. What I think ultimately is going on, and I sort of pit resources against motivations, ability versus motivation. I sort of pit them against each other more as a rhetorical strategy because I feel like the literature almost completely ignores motivation. So my argument is to say motives matter. But I think that ultimately the real story is interactions between these things, where interactions between motivation, motives, various motives, and ability, interactions between making reforms that make voting easier and motives and resources. And I think that's ultimately where the action is. But I haven't looked at those reforms specifically because I haven't focused my research explicitly on turnout. And so I've been looking at a variety of types of participation, and so haven't dug in on the relative size of this versus reforms.
I'm John Size. I'm a political scientist at George Washington University. I was reminded, in fact, just tweeted, connection
Great.
between your finding in the NARAL experiment and the Obama campaign's experimentation with
Yes.
their fundraising emails in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people have probably seen these stories, but they did, experimentation where they would send different emails to different small groups of supporters and see which messages worked best. And in one of the reporting of the findings, the most successful email was the one that said, "I will be outspent," and that raised about $3 million, $2.5 million, compared to one that said, "Thankful every day," which has raised about $500,000. Also, the second best email was "some scary numbers," and that raised $2 million. So, to me, it's not that the positive messages or opportunities this bothers people.
Sure.
Right? Like, it seems normatively problematic if our democracy and participation in democracy is based on threats.
Sure.
As opposed to some sort of more noble motivation like civic duty or what have you. Do you have thoughts about how we should think about the role of motivation normatively, whether we should sort of resign ourselves to the fact that people get involved in politics to help somebody win and make the other side lose, and therefore, that's exciting to them and that's great, or should we be concerned and wish that people's motivations were so high?
Sure. Well, I think from a campaign perspective, threat is the most expedient motive to tap into. You need to raise a lot of money quickly, go with threat. But and I want to make contrast a political campaign and a candidate who needs to get people activated very quickly for a very short period of time, give me money now, vote for me, and then is done until the next election. And I want to compare that to an interest group who is trying to cultivate membership and whose bread and butter is continued membership over time. And what I want to suggest, and I don't have any data on this, and I want this data, is that threat is a good way to get people in, but it's not a good way to keep people. As an interest group, for example. Because you can't keep telling people over and over again that the sky is falling, the sky is falling. I mean, one of these, either they're going to stop looking up, or they're going to say, you're not a very good organization. If you can't actually, if you're telling me, give me money and we're going to avert these threats, one day I'm going to connect that that's not happening. But never underestimate an organization's ability to turn a win into a loss, to turn it into a threat message. I didn't show you this one, but organizations do this all the time. Back in another life, I was a canvasser, and I worked for political organizations, and I worked a phone center, and I managed, and I wrote scripts and trained people to get on the phones every night and call for organizations that typically lost everything that they worked on. But one day we had a win. It was a pretty big win in Congress, and we had to get on the phones that night. Right? And so we had to rewrite a script saying, thanks, we won, but now our opponents are going to work even harder. So we need your money more now than we needed it before we won. Okay? And again, I think that that's an expedient way to go, but over the long haul, I don't think that it's particularly effective over time. So what the data I would love to have is to be able to look at interest group letters over time and see how threat letters work versus opportunity letters for new members versus members who have been around for a while. But threat expedient, yes, but I think that there's a problem normatively and then also just practically in continuing with threat over and over. Yeah.
Let me talk about that, the idea of enthusiasm. With regard to, I'm Sasha, I'm a journalist. With regard to turnout, and I think that one of the reasons, my supposition is one of the reasons that there were sort of wildly different projections in the public and private polling about competition in the electorate, people were using some idea of self-reported enthusiasm or intensity as a screen for likely voters. And hoping you could sort of views on how self-reported intensity, desire to vote, sort of interact with each of these different motivations and the sort of questions of habit around voting.
Yeah, so here's where I wish my dissertation, one of my advisees was here, because his dissertation is on habit and voting, and he's got a lot of really neat mobilization experiments on this topic. The thing about those enthusiasm screens, to me, and I think their inability ultimately to really do a good job of predicting turnout is because enthusiasm about the act of voting and actual voting don't really match up particularly well. And so that expressed enthusiasm, first of all, it's an easy expression to make. And then election day comes, and you've got to get up and you've got to get to the polls and do that. And if it's not part of what I would call a habit, in the most general sense, I don't think that enthusiastic expression will connect very well with it. Now, the alternative is that what that enthusiasm expression is doing is just tapping people who are already habitual voters. But if that were the case, then we'd see a better match between enthusiasm and turnout, which we don't see. It's tricky because I don't think that indicator is doing much, I think, at all to really tap into people's desire or willingness to actually vote. So I don't think it's really tapping a motive, and I think it's expressing something, but obviously that's not completely good, well connected to turnout in and of itself. Excuse me.
Questions from students would be wonderful.
And incidentally, the field experiment, so I started with NARAL, Ohio, because I had access there for that experiment. I've done a series of other survey experiments using threats and opportunities with the abortion issue, both sides of the issue. I've also done gun control, and I've also done the environment. And again, both sides of gun control. Environment's difficult to do because people don't express that they're anti-environment in surveys very well. So I've done pro-environment and threats and opportunities on the pro side, but I've done gun control both sides, abortion both sides, and I see the same basic threat effects on willingness to contribute money in those cases. Yeah.
Beth Miller, the political science professor at the University of Missouri, Tennessee. I wanted to talk a little bit about that interaction between sort of the ability or sort of the resource model approach in terms of political interest and then motives, because I think you're right, there is an interaction there. But can you talk a little bit about what you think it might be? Because I think, there is a difference between motivating people who are really interested in politics versus those who aren't, and what kinds of motives those could be.
So I think, I'm going to set up resources aside for a minute and talk about interest and motives. I have this grand model someplace. It's got lots of boxes and lots of arrows, and one of these days I'll actually test all the various parts of it, although it's prettier not to test it because it looks so nice. But one of the things that I think is going on is that what interest in politics, and why interest in politics is such a big predictor, what interest in politics does is interest is measuring, in a sense, how the extent to which politics is sort of a hobby for people. And so the way I see interest and motives working here is that if you have a general motive, and a lot of these motives aren't necessarily explicitly political. So you have this motive, you just moved to a new location, and so your goal is to meet people. How are you going to do that? Well, what am I interested in? And so interest may be the thing that pushes someone in the political direction to satisfy a motive. So I've got these grand ideas about experiments that would manipulate a motive, but would give people a variety of different ways to fulfill that motive, some of them being political and some of them not being political. And my guess would be the interest in politics would moderate that. That's not particularly earth-shattering. But then the question is how to motivate the people who aren't interested. Okay? And so there I think the real issue becomes connecting the motive with participation. Okay? Convincing people that participating in politics, whether it be voting, whatever the particular behavior is that you are interested in increasing participation for, is connecting the motive with participation, convincing people that contributing money to this candidate is a really good way to satisfy this motive. Okay? And I think, and maybe a better way to do it than other things that you could be doing with your money. Okay? And that's not easy. And so I think that without interest, it's a lot harder to do this. And it has to be something with the motive connecting with participation and getting people to think that it's going to be an effective way to do it. And I think, abilities, interacting motives with ability, that's not, again, particularly earth-shattering. I mean, if you've got the motive and you think participation is a great way to satisfy that motive, you're going to participate to the extent that you have the ability to do so. But I think also that motives can overcome resource deficits too. So I don't think it's necessarily you must have the resources. I mean, Andrea Campbell's work shows some of this with senior citizens participation, that people who you wouldn't ordinarily expect to participate, and our models wouldn't predict that they would, are particularly likely to when something in this case is threatened in her work, but when the motive is there. Yeah, please.
My name's J.J. Moore. I'm a freshman here at Iowa State. Going to major in business economics and finance. And I'd be interested to hear you speak about how during this last campaign, when we're talking about the effects of threats, from both sides we saw threats that were outrageous, that were not true. And for example, from the Obama campaign, you would hear Mitt Romney's going to and he's going to try to make abortion illegal, which wouldn't have been the case. He would have stopped funding for Planned Parenthood, but he wouldn't have made abortion illegal. He would have done that at the Supreme Court. And then we would hear things like, from the other side of the spectrum, we would hear, Obama wasn't born in America. We would hear just ridiculous statements that really have no relevance, but as a threat, they would catch the attention of maybe people who aren't that interested in politics. So maybe I just like to hear you speak about how we're going to move forward when these threats get so outrageous that it's almost nonsense.
Sure. And you're asking a really important normative question, and it connects a little bit to John's question. There's a point at which the expedience of a threat message can be overtaken in a way that the messages become so outrageous that I think that and I don't, we've got more and more fact checking that goes on that attempts to nip this in the bud in some sense, but the misinformation, the exaggerations that are born out of this desire to activate people over threat take on a life of their own, and for small subsets of the population, it's very difficult to undo that. So I don't think that there's any way to stop it. I think it's going to continue. I think from an expediency standpoint, for candidates, for interest groups, for political organizations trying to activate people, they may activate people who are very passionate, but it's an increasingly small group. So I think in a sense of a general good idea to get lots of people active, they're not particularly effective, I think, in that way. But they do arouse the passions of a small group who can be very active. So in that sense, they're unfortunately effective, I guess, but detrimental in the long run. Excuse me, Dave.
This is a little bit outside of your work, and so it might be unfair to ask, by which I mean I'm going to ask.
Sure.
And this is sort of taking on some of these things of how much do we know about what actually makes threats work, right? So I mean, this discussion of some of these things are so outlandish that of course that's not going to work on me. My idiot brother will work on him, but I mean, do we have much of a sense of what makes threats work? What makes them sink their hooks into people?
Well, first I would say that all threats aren't the same. And so in the one sense, we can go back to prospect theory and we can talk about certain types of threats of potential losses. And the reason that they work is because people actually value things that they currently have and don't want to lose them. And so when you tell someone they're going to lose something that they have, that can be motivating. But these other types of things, Obama wasn't born in America, is not that kind of a threat, right? I mean, you could walk through it and get to that point. He's got a grand plan to turn us into a socialization, and so therefore we're going to lose the thing that we have, which is democracy. I mean, that's like 8 steps to get there. So I don't think we can use prospect theory as a way to help us understand how those types of threats are effective. Some of Dan Kahn's work argues that those types of threats or broadly misinformation work because they tap into a cultural worldview that a person has, and to the extent that that cultural worldview is challenged, or that the threat or misinformation more broadly taps that worldview and maybe threatens it. They can be effective because they seem to have a ring of truth to them, because they seem to fit with a person's broad worldview. So they can be particularly effective in that way because they seem true. And if you think that is true, that Obama wasn't born in America and he's got this grand plan, then heck yeah, I'm going to act on that. Yeah, do you want to?
I think that's enduring. Getting back to what you said about the groups that say the same thing over and over again. You flash up the NRA thing, switch black helicopters, UN, and you got the same stuff in the 1990s.
Sure.
And they haven't lost credibility on Dave Wilsey's prayer for the university.
Correct. And they haven't lost credibility, and I don't have an answer as to why not. But these.
Well, I think it's what you're just saying.
Yeah.
Taps into that identity, that worldview that they have,
Right.
which is an enduring threat that's always present in
Right.
their minds.
Yeah, to that subset.
Yeah.
Yes. And that-
Well, I'm Amy Erickson, and I'm an assistant professor here at ISU. I wanted to cede my spot to a student here this evening. Otherwise, here's my question. So you mentioned at the very end of the talk that these kinds of motivations could potentially mitigate the negative impact of resources on persuasion. So very brief, like two-second aside. I'm teaching comparative
Please.
politics, and I have a number of comparative politics students in the room. There is a very strong association between things like income and education in the U.S. and vote. And the strength of the association between things like education and income and the propensity to vote varies around the world. So in the U.S. it's really very strong that the richer you are, the more likely you are to vote. The better educated you are, the more likely you are to vote. And these things, the extent of this association and there are some countries where this association is not quite strong, particularly Spain. In any case, with respect to your finding, or to your argument, this could mitigate the negative impact of resources. Do you find either that some motivations are stronger among people at different levels of resources, or that some motivations have stronger impacts on the propensity to participate in politics among people at different levels of resources?
Those are two really good questions. And to the first one, I haven't looked at this in a long time. But when I originally did a series of the survey work on the broader set of motives using the volunteer functions inventory, I started that work correlating those motives. And the way we ask these questions is when thinking about how you're going to spend your free time, and then I ask them about how you're going to spend your disposable income. How important is it that the activity, and then each of the motives is asked? And there are a variety of questions that for each of the different motives. And so what I'm looking at is the relationship between the importance of the motive and income and education and so forth. And
I haven't looked at this in a long time, but my memory is that I didn't see that many differences, and that was kind of odd to me. And I think that's why I haven't gone back to it, because I'm not exactly sure where to go with it. But I actually think that that's not part of the thing. Is that there's in some sense for a lot of these motives, they're kind of like values. People in general think they're important. So I think that the action isn't in thinking that the motive is important. I think where the action is, and I don't have data on this yet, is in thinking that politics is an effective way to satisfy that motive. And I think that's where the variation is going to be. And this may tap some feelings of efficacy in one's own ability to engage in the action in a way that's going to satisfy the motive. But I don't think it's the motives themselves that are going to vary by resources. I think it's going to be connecting the motive with action, or actions as being effective ways to satisfy the motives. And to your second question, the problem, I can't answer it right now because the only studies where I actually have measured actual behavior, the field experiment work, I can't really get a good handle on income levels and things like that. I mean, I can. In that particular study, I used Franklin County and I looked at Democratic women. It was even more limited than that. I focused on the zip codes within the county from which NARAL had drawn a lot of their members from already. They tended to be higher socioeconomic status Democratic women. So I don't have a lot of variance to even try to look at the relationship between, say, income and the motive and being effective. And then in all the survey work, or the survey experiment, where my dependent variable isn't actual behavior, but it's willingness to act, the resources don't constrain expressions of willingness to act as much as they obviously constrain actual behavior. So what I need is more field experiment work that I can get, where I can get individual level demographic data as well and look at that variation.
Your remarks in the grassroots show, did nothing seem to be associated with voting very much?
Yeah.
Then, would it make a difference between high participation elections, such as a presidential election, and low participation special elections, primary elections, school board elections?
Don, can you introduce yourself?
Pardon?
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, John Ostrom, retired professor at East Davidson Office.
Fellow Minnesotan. So the one I'm trying to remember the dates of these. The survey experiment that I showed you was done in 2004. So that one was it was in June of 2000. So it was prior. And so the questions were all about, in the next 6 months, how likely is it that you're going to engage in a variety of these behaviors? I think that, and again, it's a presidential election. It's a high participation election. I think that the implication of your question is probably right, that low participation elections, there will be more room for motives to operate and to be more effective at getting people to participate. But again, the trick is connecting the motive to voting in a school board election, right? And convincing people and getting people to believe that voting in a typically low participation election is going to be an effective way to satisfy whatever the motive might be that you're working with. But to the extent that less people participate in general in those, there's more movement, more potential for movement in the direction of increasing participation. But again, the trick is connecting and convincing people that it's an effective way to satisfy the motive.
Other questions?
Students?
We don't know any of your names, so we can't call them directly.
Yeah.
Brian, as a
good question, which I haven't ever thought of, obviously. I can give you my off the cuff sort of attempt here, off the record.
Usually when I ask political scientists to comment on journalism, they can go on for a long time.
Here's where I'll say I'm not really a political scientist. I'll pull the psychology card here. Yeah. I think that as more and more campaigns are taking advantage of the data that they have at their disposal now and doing more and more micro-targeting and more very crafted messages to potential donors, potential voters. I think that, and the problem is in the coverage of that, you don't see that until after the election. So in a day-to-day coverage of an election, it's hard to dissect how campaigns are using motives and report on that because they're not going to tell you that. And so I think that after the fact, I think that there's a lot that can be done in dissecting the effectiveness of particular campaigns and reporting on potential effectiveness in being able to craft messages that tap a variety of motives. That campaigns, what the Obama campaign did was tweak this, figure out which one worked. Now, not completely. That's a little bit of an overstatement because there were clearly social scientists working with them, and there was some theory-driven work there as well. But there was a lot of little tweaks, and whichever one worked, we're gonna go with. So I mean, I think it's hard because you don't see this until after the fact. I mean, you can dissect the campaign ad, the latest campaign ad, but they're not operating at the level that I'm talking about here in really tapping particular motives. So I'll have to think about that a little bit more.
Hi, Seth Maska, political scientist at the University of Denver, student of life. Actually, I wanted to return to something you were talking about before, sort of the utility of the threat message over time. Mm-hmm. You were suggesting that there are only so many times you can go to the well if a threat never actually materializes. And I actually want to press you a little bit on that, just get a sense of, do we actually have evidence of it? It seems like the NRA has been warning of the big federal takeover for years. As far as I know, financially they're doing okay. Right. So just wondering, among this subset of donors, does that continue to work?
Well, I don't think it's that does the threat actually materialize is the if you're not effectively able to thwart the threat, to ward off the threat. It sort of works, I guess. So let me say it this way. If, as an organization, you keep talking about, we need your money because of this threat. We need your money because of this threat. We need your money because of this threat. As a potential donor, you're looking at that organization and saying, is this an effective organization? And if they keep losing and if they can't avert the threats, then you're not. Then I think that potentially, and I don't have any evidence of this. This is a hypothesis, so I can speculate wildly here. That over time, with donors, with long-term members, I think that becomes problematic, and it's not because they're looking at whether the threat materializes or not. In fact, the threat not materializing actually helps the organization because they can say, with your help, we prevented that from happening. So the NRA can keep saying they're going to take away their guns, they're going to take away our guns, they're going to take away our guns, but thanks to your contributions, they haven't yet. But if, back in the days when I was fundraising, the organizations that I worked for lost all the time. And so to say, we need your money, we need your money, we need your money to avert that threat, and then to say, yeah, we lost. We need your money again because there's another threat. I think that's where it potentially becomes problematic. But it's not about the threat not materializing. That's the problem. It's that the organization isn't effective at potentially averting the threat.
So the fact that what we've been warning about has never happened is proof that we're selling the truth.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sure.
Are those organizations you're working for
No, trying to affect change. Yeah, which is very different.
So Scott McClure, political scientist at Southern Illinois University. This discussion has made me wonder a lot about two particular things that you don't have any data on. So I'm going to ask you to speculate some more. One comes from our student participants, where at what point do we need to start thinking about the credibility of the arguments, right? So is it an individual trait that I'm, willing to believe, that Romney is, going to replace Christianity or something like that? Whatever crazy thing people come up with. Or is it more a structure of the message itself? So that's one question. The other thing is where does the role of actual factual information play here as well? Are people just so resistant to facts? They're so bias-seeking that they can't sort of get over themselves, and so they can be possibly re-motivated with threat constantly, or is that very context-specific?
So let me take the second one first, and then you'll remind me of the first one after I speculate wildly here. So I think that in terms of the role of facts in this process, I think that there, again, going back to this notion that a lot of what these crazy messages do is tap into a worldview. Right? To the people who believe them, they have a ring of truth or a kernel of truth to them, and they are facts, okay, in some
So what about the regular Joe, though,
Yeah.
right? Who's still getting threat messages.
Right.
At what point do those become, can we immunize them with?
I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of these messages, a lot of the NRA messages, the NARAL messages, these threat messages are, I mean, they're spin, they're frames, is what they are, and so you can't fact check them. So if NRA says people are mobilizing to take away your guns, well, what's going on in Congress right now? I mean, so most of the messages that I deal with, or that I think are that campaigns or interest groups are using, to the extent that if they're factual to the extent that they're emphasizing one side of an issue and they're framing an issue in a particular direction. And so they're not debatable or fact-checkable in that sense. To say that that women are going to lose some of the rights that they now have and that these threats are real, again, is not something that you can say, hey, you're lying to people, and that's not factual. Now that's not the same as Obama wasn't born in the U.S. or Romney is a Mormon and is going to turn us into what. So that's a little bit, those are way out of my expertise. And tag on to this? Or?
I want to answer Ryan's question.
Please. Good, because you are a political scientist. Help me out. Political scientists, help me.
This isn't a question for you, David.
No, please.
Obviously, you can sort of, do you have any further thoughts? This is what I would say.
I should have just turned to John immediately.
One thing that I think about your findings and the way the journalists react, and gets to the question I asked about the normative importance of them. And this is not a generalization about Sasha and Ryan. I'm excluding them from following a statement about journalism. Journalists are a funny combination. They're very hard-bitten, but they're also very sensitive souls in some ways.
So which part it doesn't apply to Ryan and Sasha?
It strikes me that on the one hand, they see a lot of the nasty stuff that goes on in politics, and they're very desensitized to that, and they're very cynical about it. But there's this real motivation in a lot of journalism about politics to sort of, hold up an ideal about democracy that sort of would suggest that these kinds of threat or emotion, negative
respond to it.
ways. Not in this sort of every negative ad wins you votes for a candidate
Sure.
way. But then when we're thinking about other modes of participation like activism, people who might be predisposed to give money to a political organization, which is not the vast majority of Americans, but might be motivated by these kinds of things, we just need to grapple with that as a reality about the way the world works. Not something we necessarily need to sort of lament, in a sort of knee-jerk fashion. The second point, it seems to me like it would be that I would be curious whether the organizations that are involved in trying to mobilize people in the way that you sort of illustrated, what is their working theory of the electorate?
Right.
Is the theory of the National Rifle Associations, to get to Scott's point, we can basically say that your guns are going to be taken away year after year, forever.
Sure.
Even when your guns are still sitting there in your house and you've had bought some new
Some new ones over the years.
Does that work better with a Democratic president? Probably. But
Yeah.
Nevertheless, what is their motive? What is their theory of the electorate and how they think their members or how they think the voters respond to these kinds of things? They're probably not going to tell Ryan or Sasha on the record, yeah, we think our members are basically rubes who believe any outlandish thing
Sure.
we say about a Democratic president, and they'll just sort of, open up their wallets. But it's an interesting question because what the perceptions of political actors about how voters behave or how citizens behave, to me, is an interesting question. It may or may not align with the social scientific view, but they're going to make decisions based on their views no matter what. And so trying to understand what those views are is interesting. And it may be that they have actually always sort of intuitively known what the social science suggests, or maybe not. But either way, it becomes an interesting story. I'm always looking for sort of synergies between
Sure.
social science and then the actual practical politics. There seems like a lot of potential for that in this piece, more so than a lot of other things.
Yeah, well, and there's also another point that you reminded me of, which is that, well, first of all, and there is data on this, environmental organizations, the worst thing that happened to environmental organizations was Clinton being elected. I mean, there's time series data on this. Sierra Club lost tons of membership, tons of money during the Clinton administration. But to the extent that threat works, it's working because people are trying to prevent something from happening. So we've got a status quo, and then what's happening is there's a threat to change that status quo, and who is mobilized with the people who want to stop that change from happening. And so one of the sort of longer term effects of threat messages is it's very hard to change policies, direction in the U.S. And so it's one of the reasons, I think, why we get more status quo than we get change, because the more vocal members of the electorate are the ones wanting to prevent the change. Not always, of course, but yeah, the sort of what is the operating assumption of NRA members, and not just NRA members, obviously, but how do these organizations talk to their members during friendly administration, times of friendly administrations for them? Do they continue to use threat messages? And I don't have the answer to these questions. Some organizations do a really good job of archiving. People for the American Way has this great archive of their letters over time, and I'd love to get my hands on that to look at how those messages change for various administrations, but I don't have access to that data currently. But that would be interesting to see, I think, and how they speak to their members during friendly times, which is harder to do.
Why don't we thank Joanne?
Thank you.
We have a little break before the next person. There's some 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 person. There's some